Hello, welcome everyone to another edition of the Subseasonal Forecast Contest on February 16th, Tuesday, February 16th. So we're forecasting out into March here, March 3rd, March 7th. In terms of today's agenda, I think we'll go back. Yesterday we had Matt Rogers as the guest host, or last week, and kind of ran things a little bit differently. But for today, I think I'd suggest anyway, we'll start with our attribution, look back the past couple of weeks, which I think have been interesting, and then look forward to the current forecast, which has also been or is interesting and full of potential havoc. Other than that, is there any? I mean, I know there's a lot of extreme weather going on. Any particular items that you guys want to kind of address? Any winter storms or cold outbreaks or any other weather phenomena going on that you guys want to try to cover today? No?
Hey, Dave. This is Dark Angelo.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah, I wouldn't miss this one today from the standpoint that what's happening in the middle of the country, in particular Texas. I think that we could spend maybe a few minutes kind of talking about the unfolding of what happened there and the ramifications that might come from that. But I have to say, as an operational forecaster, going on close to 30 years now, this might rank in the top, clearly the top 10 or so. I just don't know. I don't have a ranking really mentally, but this is a real, this is almost like a highlight of my career in terms of like seeing an event like this. We were just kids the last time, and some of these people on the call were not born yet when the last time Dallas was below zero and Houston was in the low teens, minus 14 in Oklahoma City this morning. And as much as this has missed the East Coast, the cold was really a few hundred miles literally from causing a what would have been the highest degree day in my database going back to 1950. As it is, it's a pretty outstanding day, even without the major East Coast cities involved. So for me, it's just an appreciation of how extreme this event that's occurring presently is, really.
Yeah,
I'm pretty excited. If you
yeah.
I don't show a lot of. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think we all know probably someone out in Texas or whatever. I know I've got my mother-in-law's in Houston and stuff, and yeah, thankfully she didn't lose power and stuff. But boy, this scared the bejesus out of a lot of people right down there. And I've got a buddy in Oklahoma City, he's a TV meteorologist, and I think he said the other day that he slept in his car because it was, I don't know what I haven't talked to him today, but it was 2 nights ago. It was it was already snowing badly and they wanted him on call and he really didn't think he could get home and come back, so he was like spending some sleeping in his car. So yeah, it was pretty bad situation, huh? Okay, yeah, so we'll definitely spend some time on that, and if anyone thinks of anything else, just let us know. So I guess just looking back at our most recent verification, I guess it's this guy. So this is the forecast verifying for Feb 10th to 14th. And let's see the verification all the way at the bottom here. Yeah, so this was obviously a big one. Almost 190, almost 190 HDDs. And it's funny. You look at persistence at that point, was extremely low, which I'm sure doesn't help. Obviously, this is what was kind of behind us, and it was a very warm period, relatively speaking. And you see what the normals were, 142 and 140 respectively. So we blew away the normals. And then let's see what other benchmarks we have. The EC and CFS. The EC 142 and the CFS. The CFS, I mean, look at that. Wow. It's funny, Dr. Decker's, it's good to have you on the line here because for the last over a month now, you've brought up the fact that this CFS has actually performed by hook or by crook fairly well this winter. And this is another example. And it wasn't just, it's not just this forecast. Here, I'll click on the season to date. And granted, this is just once weekly, but looking at the performance of the CFS, I've since we started the contest, we've never had a season like this. I'm almost certain, summer or winter, where this deep into a season, 17 forecasts, the CFS scores plus 14, and the ESMWF scores about -1, and it's directionally too. I think I was looking at this the other day. Yeah, directionally, the CFS is at about 82%, and the EC is about 76, 77%, meaning, it's not just like, hey, got one forecast a lot better that skewed the distribution. It's been better overall. So I think that's an interesting data point in itself. Let's go back.
I just want to interject. Yeah. So in this case, the CFS got a little lucky, I think, because I remember this was that period where there was extreme run-to-run volatility. So if you use the CFS forecast from the previous cycle, it probably would have been at the bottom of the rankings, I think, from what I remember from that day.
Let's take a look. Here's the forecast before the CFS.
No, not our contest forecast, but just
I see,
the previous cycle. If we had a slightly different time frame in terms of when we took the forecasts and entered them into the contest, that kind of thing.
That's a really good point, and that would be an interesting research exercise. Presumably, the CFS forecast on Maxar's site that they use here would do better. I believe Maxar mentions in the fine print here that they take an average of like the last 10. It might be 4, but I think it's even 10 CFS runs to come up with their thing. Whereas we just take the latest 0-0 run. So you get a lot of whiplash, like Dr. Decker mentioned. But again, even with that whiplash, over 17 forecasts this winter, the CFS has performed better than the EC, which it's a lot of forecasts to be lucky. And again, previous years, it wasn't, right? I mean, all you have to do is go through these tabs. I won't do it right now, but if you go through these seasonal tabs here, I think every season the EC won. I don't think there's been an exception. So it's just it's interesting. I don't know. Maybe I don't want to just gloss over that. Does any and I'm also not trying to say that if I was a betting man today that in fact I don't, in my weighting scheme, I don't put more weight on the CFS than the EC. But does anyone want to provide any other thoughts or insight into what we're seeing this winter between the CFS and EC?
Dave, just real quick on it's less a comment about the CFS and more comment about the Euro. In particular, not just the Euro weeklies, but the Euro ensembles, which we obviously don't have the benefit of like letting, fitting numbers to this because, we're out in a week 3 space. But to me, there needs to be a real tremendous post-mortem done on the lack of performance. If I should just say outright terrible performance by the EC this month, in particular, the volatility that we've seen and how incorrect it's really been in the central part of the North America for the last 15 or so days, maybe even a bit longer than that. I think the CFS has been a little bit more consistent. I don't recall what it was, for instance, the day before that this forecast was made, so I can't really comment on that. But the EC's performance is really lacking in its not just ability to see this air mass, so to speak, but to consistently show it. It was only a week ago, Friday, which would have been the 5th of February, when we all went home for the weekend with some of the warmest EC runs we've seen, and it just parking the Arctic air over the Dakotas and allowing everybody from Texas to Maine to get extremely warm. And it clearly couldn't have been more wrong. So I think the postmortem needs to be done more in the Euro than the CFS, but that's just more of an aside as to how that model has not just underperform, but it's causing a lot of wringing of hands these last couple of weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, and let's just look at the maps while we're talking about this a little bit. Again, by hook or by crook, there's the CFS, and obviously, for approximately this period that just verified, and obviously it looks a lot better than the EC. There's the EC right there. Let's also look at this from a 500 millibar pattern standpoint. I'm curious. I did not look at this earlier. Let's do global. I don't know. I like global. Is it? All right. So there's our verification, and let's look at our. Or did I already do it? Yeah, I did. Okay. So there's the EC, and let me get the CFS. All right. So CFS, EC. And I should put these side by side, probably, right? See if I can do it without blowing this up. Probably not. Move this one over. Try that. Get at least somewhat of a view. Right. There we go. So EC and it's interesting. I don't know. And all right, let me just take a look at the CFS here real quick. Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, Dave, the CFS just really did a much better job with the ridging that spread west across all of northern Canada and
Yeah.
the nearby Arctic.
Yeah.
It also did much better at identifying the possibility of a deep low, kind of south and west of the Aleutians, which is a significant, I think, interruption in the pattern, which allowed the cold to come into the middle of the continent.
Yeah.
So, in that way, the CFS was far superior,
Yeah.
just at like a high level view.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it's it's interesting though. It's like God, I'd love to do and I know Maxar probably has something close to this, but just even a spatial correlation on these two maps here, the CFS EC versus this. Because on one hand, Dave, I think you're 100% right. On one hand, I think, obviously I'm just guessing here, just subjectively looking at these maps, but I'm like, the EC is not terrible if you look at this from a global, or at least let's say the hemispheric, like north of the equator. However, on the other hand, across critical areas, clearly, like you're saying, the CFS did better. Up here, right? The EC suggested that there was not going to be this blocking or this cutoff where you could really produce some a crazy cold on the lee side of the Rockies. It allowed for more of this continuous Pacific flow, which is obviously a much warmer pattern. On the other, but on the hair, you see that it did catch the ridge, right? There was a nice ridging there, and such. It did catch a little bit more that the trough was going to be across Western North America, and that's kind of what happened. More ridging in the east, whereas the CFS didn't catch. The CFS just broad troughing everywhere. But and like Dave said, arguably though, where it mattered the most, at least for the United States, at least for the eastern 2/3 of the United States, it also caught this small but arguably critical feature right near northwest Hawaii, south of the Aleutians, right, which helped with the Rossby wave dispersion and such. Where and back to Dave's point, I know there's been research in the past. I've looked at this objectively. It's been a couple years, but that suggests that the EC has a ridge bias, anomalous ridging, right along this area. And I remember thinking, that in situations like that, like in this, where you already have a base state where you have some anomalous ridging, such as oftentimes happens in a linear pattern, that there could be this part's subjective, but something I always want to test. that getting out of that pattern, just like what recently happened, could be a systematic error of the model. In other words, because the base state already has some ridging, and then there's an error on top of that it's putting even more ridging, that it's going to be hard, if you will, for that model to reverse when that reversal actually comes, and that it might suggest something like what just happened. I'm playing Monday morning quarterback a little bit. I'd like to test this, but that it might maintain that subtropical or mid-latitude ridging in place too long, and thus, maybe situations like this where you miss some critical pattern changes. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that or has looked into that a little bit or thinks anything about it. The only other thing, why folks are thinking about that or chewing on that, I did want to look at the MJO during that period, right? Because I don't know, my thoughts were that could also been something important here, in terms of why maybe the models missed some of the stuff. So let's just look at the timing though. So this was so this is a forecast from what, the 26th, we said, around the 26th. Let's look at what the MGO was doing around that time. So I hate reading these things. So where was it? It was this is let's go back to this one. This will be easier to read, I think. Yeah. All right, so the green line's January. So January 26th, it was around here. Yeah, if I remember correctly, this was kind of an interesting period, right? In that we had the MGO, which had some momentum in terms of it looked like becoming more gangbusters. On the other hand, we were coming out of a period. Let's go back to the 26th here too. We were coming out of a period where we, and I remember Dave and I talking about this. We had the stratospheric warming, but we weren't seeing a lot of response from it, right? Or we were seeing a lot of mixed signals. But here's that signal in the SPCZ, which I think, Dave talked about some ideas for research. I think this is another one of those things where I think it would be really interesting just to really, not just to look at this in terms of an index type thing, like in a RMM, although, you could do that too. But just kind of, if I had some time, right, to look at, kind of periods where, you see kind of explosive, highly anomalous, if you will, activity across the SPCZ, and see if there's any systematic errors associated with the model response to that 10 to 20 days later, i.e., to Dave's point, like, is that part of, the EC maybe missed some of the response that from that, and is that something that we could learn from and pick up on for future situations? Anyone have any thoughts on that? Okay. I don't know, anything else before we move on to the forecast? Is there anything else that folks want to look at in terms of the recent verification here? Very good. Okay. All right. So let's look at the forecast, I guess, right? It's always easier to like look back and analyze, right? Play Monday morning quarterback, so to speak, right? That's a lot more fun than having to put yourself out there and make a forecast that could bust. All right, so these are the forecasts, and just looking at everyone. Now, I'm sorry if I mispronounced, but is it Elena on the line?
Yes, that's it.
How are you?
Pretty good. How about you?
Doing well. Thanks for joining.
Of course.
We typically now, Elena, looks like you didn't make a forecast today. Is that right?
I just haven't put it in yet. My plan was to put it in after this is all over.
Oh, you were planning to cheat. No, I'm just kidding. No, of course.
No, I didn't get a chance to look at it before the call, so.
Okay. Well, like I think you've seen this. You may have seen us do this before. A lot of times, what we try to do is we'll have other folks, in particular student members, kind of share their forecast ideas and stuff like that. Now, I know obviously you haven't yet submitted your forecast. And by the way, we do that just, to give you sort of uh, as something we think is constructive, right? It's like, something you're going to have to do in the industry, right? Like Dave Darkangelo, who's on the line, who works in the industry, right? He every day, multiple times a day, he's talking to his end users, which are traders and analysts and things like that, and he's communicating the forecast to folks who, in some cases, are not nearly as technical or have the meteorological background. So it gives you an opportunity also to to practice those communication skills and things like that.
Absolutely.
So I was going to say, I know you haven't submitted your forecast yet, but have you looked at things yet? Are there any things that you want to you'd like to share? That you think-
So I did look, I believe it was Sunday night, so it was a little bit ago, but I wanted to touch base on what the positive and negative teleconnections really have an effect on making a forecast um, for the game, essentially. Because I'm still, working my way through classes and everything like that, and haven't exactly pinpointed on why they matter and why we need to know, what the importance of a positive and negative AO or NAO really means on our forecast.
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually your timing's really great because I think if he's okay, Philip, are you on the line now?
I did just join.
Okay, Philip, if you don't mind, I'm going to put you on the spot in a second. We had a great question from Elena. She was asking about how teleconnections, like the AO, like you see on the screen, influence a forecast. And of course, that's a little bit subjective. In other words, like every forecaster may just like a model, just like the ECMWF, they may weight a teleconnection a little bit differently in their forecast process. But the reason why I think Philip would be great to talk about this is, Philip, I know you can see it in his forecast process. If you like read through his forecast, he oftentimes talks about the different teleconnections and things like that. And so I know he uses the teleconnections. Also, Philip's been forecasting in the contest for quite a while. So, Philip, if you wouldn't mind, would you share with Elena at least your thought process, how you utilize teleconnections for your forecast?
Okay, sure. So I guess I guess I can sort of explain what sort of goes through my thought process. I will qualify it though by saying that since I study more so short-term weather in general for my research, so some of the climate stuff I'm not the most familiar on, but I guess the general gist of it I can tell. So basically, the AO is it's a measure of a correlation. So it's correlating several different points and in the northern hemisphere, and it looks at if you have a certain pattern. Usually, it's some kind of sea level pattern height, or sea level pattern. If you see this certain pattern, that usually leads to some kind of pattern that then correlates to some kind of warm or some kind of cold in specific areas. So this is one way to show it. So the leading EOF, so that's like that's like a statistical method to sort of separate the sea level pressure patterns. So usually what you find is that when you have low sea level pressure, so for example, for a positive AO, if you have a very low sea level pressure, such as what is represented by the blues, what you tend to have is you have higher pressure in the areas of the reds, and vice versa, which would be a negative AO. And normally, if you raise the heights in those red regions, then what you end up doing is you, by the, let's see, let me make sure I don't get anything wrong here. By the hypsometric relation and some other relations, that means that the higher heights are usually correlated with higher temperature anomalies, which then means that you have this warmth that moves into the lower, that moves, for example, into the East Coast or into the, or into Western Europe. And conversely, if you have lower heights in those areas and you have stronger heights in near the Arctic, then what usually ends up happening is that you force the cold out of the Arctic into the mid latitudes. So the Arctic Oscillation, though, by itself doesn't necessarily tell you whether you're going to be cold or not, because the Arctic Oscillation just tells you that you have stronger or weaker heights near the poles, which means that the colder anomalies could be anywhere in the mid latitudes. So sometimes that could mean that the cold is more focused in Asia. Sometimes it means it's more focused in North America, as it has been recently. So the Arctic Oscillation by itself won't tell you necessarily where the cold is going to be. Now, the North Atlantic Oscillation, NAO, is another oscillation that is actually pretty strongly correlated to the AO. So I know some people don't like to use the NAO because they feel that it's better to just look at the AO because the two of them are pretty closely correlated. But the NAO in particular focuses on the Greenland block as opposed to the entire northern hemisphere, which is what the Arctic Oscillation looks more at when it's doing that pressure correlation. So the NAO shows that when you have a positive NAO, so let's say that you have higher heights in, or you have lower heights in the Greenland area, that often means that you have higher heights to the south, which is that area, again, that Western Atlantic Ridge. So as I mentioned, you'll notice that this map looks sort of similar to the AO, which is why I mentioned earlier that some people like to treat the AO and the NAO together. But regardless, when you have a negative NAO, then what happens is you have a very strong trough that extends in the Western and North Atlantic, and you have the Greenland high, or like a Greenland block that sets up there, which funnels the cold into the Eastern US. Now, the NAO, a negative NAO is more closely correlated with our colder temperatures. So if you see a strong negative NAO and a strong negative AO, chances are it means that you have cold pushing into the eastern or central portions of the US. And then finally, I guess the PNA is the next one I'll mention. The PNA is sort of somewhat similar to the NAO, but the PNA is looking more so at the Pacific side of things rather than on the Atlantic side of things. And the PNA in particular is a wave train that they're looking at from the equatorial Pacific stretching all the way into North America, Western North America. So the PNA now, when you have a positive PNA, as you can see, we'll take January, for example, you have this this wave pattern of higher pressure or higher heights near the Central Pacific, lower pressure or heights south of south of the Bering Sea. Then you have another ridge that shows up in Western North America, which then and then you have a trough that is in the Eastern US. So when you have a positive PNA, you usually have colder temperatures in Eastern North America, and you usually have some kind of ridge in the West Coast. And then if you have a negative PNA, then this pattern is basically reversed. So these are the three that I usually look at, especially during the winter time, where you can see that the correlations are stronger in general in January and April, as opposed to July and October, where the pattern correlation is weaker.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. You provided so much detail, and I'll definitely take that with me through making my forecast.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. And you can also, again, we keep all the forecasts up here, all the archive forecasts. So if you go to Philip's archive forecast, any of his archive forecasts, you can read about his strategies. And he, it's nice, I think, when you actually see it in practice and you see how, the thought process and how he kind of bakes it all together, cooks it all together, the numerical guidance, the the teleconnections, because some folks, they kind of, you have to piece all this together, right? And that's where it gets a little bit messy and complicated. But there's some good information here if you'd like to look back. Cool.
Not to put Michael on the spot, but I know that he looks more at the EPO than I do. So for the EPO, you might want to turn to him to explain that part of the correlation. I think he is here.
Oh yeah, hey Michael.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I I actually haven't looked at the EPO in a while because the site I used, they stopped updating it. But from what I recall with the EPO though, basically, I'm not going to be as detailed as Phil was, but the EPO, when it's negative in the winter, it's cold. There's a ridge in the I forget exactly where, but in the Alaska region. I don't remember the exact positioning. It's yeah, that the northern Alaska coast or southern, however you want to, southern Alaska coastline, however you want to view that. And that usually is able to force the jet downstream uh, to essentially be favorable for cold, widespread cold entering the United States. And the opposite, of course, happens when it's positive. It kind of prevents most major cold, kind of locks it up in Canada. That's my very limited knowledge with the EPO.
No,
And
that's great. Thank you.
and Elena, what year are you? If you don't mind me asking.
I am currently a junior, but I did transfer in, so I'm playing catch up, as they call it.
Okay. And I was just going to say, if you were looking for, not that you are, but if you're looking for an exercise, to maybe understand the relationships a little bit better, all the data from Maxar is available to folks who participate in the contest. So, like, you can download like a time series of these HDDs for a period, or we can provide that to you. And on the CPC sites, they provide the uh, like a nice time series of all the data, so you can kind of download it. They have it right on this page. If you do what I'm doing right now, which is just Google, like here, for example, the daily time series, and then there's a few different file formats here, but you can just basically download any of these, and you've got the daily time series. And then you could do some analysis, right, on Excel, or if you're a coder, using some of the coding languages and say, hey, let me look at the relationship between NAO, daily NAO, and, like temperatures, or what we commonly use in the contest, HDDs. And then you could better answer the question, like, what signal is actually stronger, has a stronger relationship with, HDDs? Is it the NAO? Is it the AO? Is it PNA? Is it the EP? That could be an exercise you might want to explore in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do have access to the Maxart data, and I have been playing around with that a lot more than I did last semester when the class participated in the game. So I'm just getting a little more familiar with it.
Sounds good. All right. Well, let me know too if you get to that point where you're diving in and you have some questions. Let me know, and I can help you out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Cool. All right. So back to the current forecast here. Yeah, Michael. So why don't we put you on the spot here? Do you want to kick us off here and kind of talk about your today's forecast?
Sure.
Let me know if you want the screen.
No, it's okay. Okay, so my value was 111.1 HDDs with an average spread of 22 HDDs. Started off the way I always do, blending together the 10-year and the EC forecasts. And using those, I started off with a value of 114.06. I didn't make any changes really to my forecast value based on the CPC. It looked kind of like essentially a wash, pretty much average temperatures across the board. And then I reduced my value by 3 HDDs based on the teleconnections. Looks like we're heading to a negative PNA regime with a positive AO and NAO, which looks to be warmer for the eastern half of the country. Sorry about that. looks to be warmer for the eastern half of the country. And that's reflected in my my forecast map, which shows, I believe I have above average for the Midwest, the East, or maybe it's the South. No, I think normal for the Midwest, above average for the South and the East, and below average for the Mountain and the West Coast regions. Yeah. So that's my forecast. Any comments, complaints, questions, or concerns?
Yeah, I guess if I was with my, you know, trader hat on or something, I guess the $1 million question is, right, like that I probably want to ask you too. Um, it's a little beyond the scope of the contest, but you know, we're here. Is this Michael, your forecast is so it's definitely, well, yeah, it's a little bit warmer than the 30-year and 10-year. We're obviously, as Dave Darkangelo mentioned, freezing cold right now. We're cold for at least the next several days, really cold. There's more storms coming.
Yeah.
Are you telling me that winter's over? Is this the end of it, or is this just a break in the pattern?
Um. So that's a good question. Based on what I'm seeing, um, at least for the period we're in, it looks like there'll definitely be at least a break. As to whether or not this is the end of winter. That's a bit further on, and I wouldn't trust the teleconnections that far out. At least not the ones I use. Now, to put on my industry hat, to coin your phrase here, Dave, and answer it maybe more uh, professionally, I would say I will have to look into that and get back to you on that.
Yeah.
That's a good answer, by the way.
I was gonna say we should ask Dave what he tells his traders.
That's a really well thought out answer. That's very good. To be fair, Dave's question was a really terrible question.
Hey, he specializes in the tough ones.
It's less tough, and it's more just being being kind of a jerk. He knows where I'm going with that. It's a leading question. I think what I'd like to point out. The idea that winter is over is a word that gets thrown around, or two words that get thrown around with far too much frequency. We've had probably about maybe 8 or 10 winter over declarations since November of last year. And here we are, coldest February in decades across the US. So, it is what it is.
Yeah. All right. Does anyone else have any more bad questions for Michael before we?
Or good ones, I'm
Or
open to both.
No, but I think that was like what Dave said. That was a good way of answering it, because you do get that, especially from jerky traders, you do get that question a lot, and it can throw you, and and the other way to look at it or to think about it too is I think a slightly more sophisticated answer or question is, can we reach the same levels? Right. And what they're saying there is, well, we're looking into March now, right? And you could do back of the envelope math and know that, normals are coming up, right? I mean, you can see it in our contest in the 30 years, right? The normal 30 year, if we just kind of scan through, that's a lot lower than it was a couple weeks ago, right? And so that's another way to kind of think about it that could be relevant. Like, again, the chance that Dallas or Houston get to these levels, it would take a much more anomalous type air mass, right? But those are also, they're it's easy to conflate those two things, I guess.
Hey, Dave, let me throw in, I'll just add one question I had this morning from one of my customers was, is this break in the pattern or reprieve a signal towards a very mild March, or is there a chance or an opportunity to at least be back to quote unquote normal? And that's a critical question this morning because of how much gas production has shut off because of the extreme cold. Even a normal March would be considered a significant event given the market dynamics right now. So that's a sample of a question I got today.
Have you found, as much as you can talk about it, like, experientially, have you seen a correlation between February weather and March weather much, or is it just, kind of flip a coin?
Is that for me, Dave?
Yeah, I was just curious what your thoughts are in terms of, can you extrapolate, as a general rule, can you extrapolate like a cold or warm Feb into March, or is it just not that simple?
So the data we've seen for the last few decades is that you cannot, that there's not a correlation. If you look at a longer time series, then there's a small correlation. But the short answer is no, but there's a big kind of asterisk with that, right? Because we've not really sampled an extreme cold February with the understanding of what that could do for March.
Okay. Okay, fair enough. And just I really don't have a strong view on that. What one thing I will say though, and this is there's not a huge amount of statistics, although I think statistics would support this. Getting like that transition from out of HDD to CDD, like April to May, I think there like it just goes to complete crap. Like it doesn't matter if it's cold April, whatever. I think that the seasonal transition is so strong. In other words, you're getting such a strong transition out of one season into another where wavelengths change and so many things are changing that even if you had like a cold April or cold March and April or vice versa or something like that, like it I think like it's easy to get drawn into thinking, hey, it's cold this April, maybe it'll be a cold start to summer, but in my experience that doesn't work well at all.
I agree. That's not something that we can lean on.
Yeah.
There's nothing to lean on, right?
Okay. All right, let's continue on. Philip, do you want to talk about your forecast today?
Give me a moment. I am still in the
For sure.
process of finalizing my submission.
Or Dr. Decker, are you still online? We could.
Although it looks like
Yeah, I
I'll
could jump
probably be warm.
Oh, we'll come back to you, Philip.
Yeah. So I can, since mine will be pretty short, because as usual, I'm just trying to turn the CPC forecast into a number. This week, there was some kind of cold in the Pacific Northwest and some warmth down in the actually Southern Plains and Southwest. And so I treated it as a very slight warm signal overall. There's a lot of equal chances on the map, especially in the east. So I just went a tiny bit below the climatology for the HDDs. They did note some uncertainty in some of the indications where maybe there was some chance of a return of some colder outbreaks in the week 3 period. So I increased my sigma a little bit to account for that. And that's what my forecast was.
Yeah. Did they give any other clues in terms of I don't know, forecast confidence or anything like that relative to this pattern? Was there any interesting nuggets in their discussion or anything today?
They discussed, well, they said over just before the 3 to 4 week period, it seemed like the La Nina conditions would be reasserting themselves.
Uh-huh.
And so a relaxation, the cold air going away. But then they attached this cold air outbreak to some convection in the West tropical Pacific. And they said there were some indications maybe that convection would return in the 3 week period or so. So that there was some chance, some risk of a further cold air outbreaks later on. So I bumped up my sigma accordingly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's interesting. Okay. All right, Philip, I guess you're up. No.
All right. Well, let's see. I guess how should I do this?
Are you in? Are you up here? Are you
I
in?
am not up here since I still need
Okay.
to actually enter my
Oh, okay.
numbers. Essentially, though, I can go through my forecast process first, and then you can see what my numbers end up being shortly after.
Okay.
That helps. All right. So starting off with my usual spiel. So I mentioned that tropical convection is currently active in the West Pacific near Indonesia with the second pulse of activity in the Amazon. So I mentioned this is consistent with the MJO signal in a strong phase 7. And the models show that the MJO is weakening, but they disagree on the further evolution of this signal. And then the lag composites for phase 7 that I was looking at suggest weakening warmth in the northern tier with increasing cold anomalies in the east, which disagrees with everything else that I've seen, and also happens to disagree with the MJO analog, although I'm not completely sure why. And the weakening La Nina is still a warm signal for us during this time. So overall, I treat the tropics as a slightly warm signal. The CPC, as was already mentioned, is showing cold in the Pacific Northwest, warmth in the south. So I treated it overall as a near normal signal since there was just equal chance for basically in most of the map. And then the teleconnections currently suggest that the AO or NAO may stay near neutral. And then the PNA is forecast to head towards negative. That ended up being the strongest of the 4 signals, at least in terms of model agreement. So I treated the teleconnections as a slightly warm signal with the negative PNA, probably neutral AO or NAO, and the uncertain forecast for the EPO as usual. The EC and the CFS are both showing a strong West Atlantic ridge and a trough that is either going to be in the northern plains or in the northern Rockies or in the Pacific Northwest. So that gives us strong warmth in the EC, but the CFS with its possible cold bias, although it has been performing better this winter, suggests a slightly more heating demand based on the Pacific Northwest. So overall, without actually crunching my numbers in yet, this looks like I will probably end up a little warmer than the 30-year mean, but probably not by much. Confidence, I would say, is probably slightly below average given the disagreement in the tropical signal and an uncertain evolution of the teleconnections.
Thanks, Philip. And you got me thinking when you were talking about these models a little bit. I mean, call me crazy. I'm done. That's all I wanted to say. No, call me crazy, but Dave brought up this point earlier about the forecast that verified, right? So looking at the left now, well, looking at the right, this is the forecast that verified, right? The one this super cold, blah blah blah. That at least the last 5 days, right? Especially across the middle part of the country. And we talked about the fact that there was more of this bridge of ridging, anomalous ridging across the north and northwest North America that helped support the cold, and that the CFS, or I'm sorry, the CFS was better at catching that. I'm just looking at the current runs here, right? There's the EC, right? And here's the CFS. I feel like there's a little bit of deja vu here. It's not exactly the same, right? But boy, the CFS definitely does show more of this bridge the gap kind of thing up across the north and over the top, which presumably would support a lot more cold. Maybe the ridging is stronger, and that could be, devil could be in the details here, and that could bottleneck the cold. But it's just interesting seeing that those differences show up again.
Certainly, the CFS has been performing much better than anticipated this heating season, so that is something that I can't exactly discount either in my forecast.
And man, maybe it's just another coincidence, but again, Dave pointed this out earlier. This arguably one of the key ingredients or components to this cold forecast is some of this this troughing subtropical troughing that helps support maybe some of the wave breaking, and down here near Hawaii and such. Um, and you definitely see a little bit more of that action in the CFS, whereas the EC again falls back to this more, I don't know. I don't know if it's even more traditional La Nina pattern, but certainly a stronger mid-latitude ridging, right, and more zonal flow, and certainly what looks to be more of a warmer pattern. So I guess back to my earlier comments. Hey, is this part of that bias? Is this just the EC's leaning too much on mid-Pacific ridging, and because of that, it's going to underestimate and maybe exponentially, non-linearly underestimate the amount of wave breaking that could occur, which would redistribute and create more cold and redistribute it further south and east. I don't know if anyone.
Hey Dave, I had a quick question here. I don't know if you remember on our Friday discussion, you and Matt Rogers alluded to the possibility that if the ridge near Greenland kind of extends a little bit more into Hudson Bay, that it might cause a split in that vortex that was being shown on the models, and split part of it off into the U.S. and cause some major cold. Is there any signs of that beginning to happen, or?
Well, I mean, so a couple things on that. So actually, Matt Rogers sent me a snapshot earlier today. I don't have it, but on his model website, they do some of the clustering where you can split up the ensemble members into clusters, and he did show that that there's certainly some scenarios that are much colder in the east than I would say the composite, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, looking at certainly the CFS, right, is much more problematic. Or if you're looking for cold, if you're looking for higher HDDs in the east, right, I think certainly the CFS is more in that camp of, if it's not there explicitly, it's like you just tweak this a little bit, and what I mean by that is, yeah, I mean, obviously you've got this block, or at least anomalous ridging, that's going to squeeze something into New England. I mean, it's actually explicitly showing that. And even the EC, I think, has some of that, right? The EC is a lot warmer, arguably because of the Pacific, but it still shows this. So I think that tells you got to watch out for New England, and especially in the Northeast in general, right? That there could be if there is Arctic air, a piece of that polar vortex could sneak in there, and it could still be really, there could be a strong gradient, between, say, New York City and I don't know, Atlanta, or even Nashville or something, but it could be very cold in the Northeast. But the other thing here is, and this is that, I think the EP, you were talking earlier about the EP, I think it's arguably the most important teleconnection for cold in the East, right? And because if this ridging really does develop more over Alaska, I think the more something like this, there's an instability here, and this is where it's implicit, and I'm using some subjective creativity here, but this looks like a very unstable air mass. In other words, to me, what more likely is going to happen, if this is like the EC, it's a little bit different. I think this is a more stable pattern with a strong flow. But this looks to me like what you're going to see is there's probably a polar vortex and vortices that could split. So a piece drops down south and west, but another piece drops into the Northeast or something like that, and this could end up being a lot colder, because you've got this all blocked up to the north, so you don't have Pacific flow, so you have a lot of cold air potential that's in Canada, and with this amount of negative WP and negative EP, I think more pieces are likely to split. So I guess that's a good segue into my forecast too. I kind of I went with the colder approach here, in part because my main thinking there was more to do with the MGO. I don't, the fact that the MGO is still in the phase 6-7, and that there's SPCZ and stuff like that. I look at this more like there's still risks that there's a break, a little bit of a warm up, but that we're still more likely to be in a cold pattern. And that's kind of what I bought into based on sort of the tropical forcing kind of signals and things like that. I wanted to bring up one other thing too, because Philip alluded to this. This is a classic case where you have to be really careful, I think, about the MJO or MJO tool, right? And I know we're going to run out of time, but Philip brought up the fact that the MJO tool today shows kind of a warmish signal versus the 30-year. And you look at this and you're like, well, why is that? My guess is it's because the MJO signal observed is, I think, actually off this chart, or not off the chart, but it's above this grid. It's probably somewhere up here based on, just looking at it visually. And that's where the data points become a lot more sparse. And so the signals are, you're going to see a lot more, signals that are probably statistically significant. So that's my guess is what's going here. It's probably the sample size is pretty small. It happens to be a few events that are warm, but I think that if you dug into this a little bit more deeply, and you would find that I think that you would probably look at this still as a cold signal based on where it's at, when you better account for if you opened up the radius and allowed for a bigger sample size. But again, I haven't done that analysis, and I didn't even look into it that much more other than what you see here, but that would be my guess, Phil.
I was wondering what was going on with that, since I was like, the lag composites on the CPC did not match this remotely, and I was very confused.
That's my best guess. My
Okay.
second guess would be that there's just a bug, but I think it's more likely that, because we've seen this in other, I forget, CDCs. We've seen this before. I've seen something like this. It's going to take a while to load, but if you kind of go through the whole grid, you'll see as you get to the edges, sometimes you do see some of those things. But it looks like we're just out of time, and I want to be respectful for everyone's day. So
one last
oh, yeah, go
comment.
ahead.
One last comment. I was looking at your forecast and my forecast, and actually our numbers are almost identical, except for the fact that I don't have the fudge factor.
Oh,
So
okay.
thought I'd point that out.
Misery loves company. Is that what you're telling me? Is that how-
I just find it amusing because I don't have the fudge factor, so I'm 115.7. But if you add 10 to that, that's basically your forecast
I see. Yeah.
with the same sigma.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, again, I know we say this every week, I feel like, or at least recently. Actually, we weren't saying it, right? Dave D'Arcangelo can attest to this. We were saying just the opposite back in November and December. But now it does seem like these forecasts and verifications are super interesting. And so, yeah, this is going to be fun to see how the next couple of weeks shape out. And hopefully we can learn a thing or two, right? So, all right. Well, thanks everyone for participating, and we'll see you again, I hope, next week. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.